To everyone and welcome to the second Raj Memorial Lecture. As you know, we have started this lecture series in this present mode from last year onwards to remember and pay homage to Professor Raj, who is actually the founder of the Center for Development Studies. And the 10th of February is actually his anniversary of his passing away. And this year it's actually the 12th anniversary. But we do have the lecture given a few days earlier or a few days later, depending according to the convenience of the lecturer. Okay. And Professor Raj was very much instrumental in establishing the Center for Development Studies. And I think the lecture is a very fitting tribute to him. And also he favored very much the following, that economic research should be evidence-based and it should be multidisciplinary in nature. Okay, so that's why, although we are at the center mostly economists, we are called the Center for Development Studies and not Center for Development Economics. And although I'm not sure how far we are multidisciplinary in terms of our research, I'm not too sure. But at the same time, I think it is very important for us to make us contact with the basics. So today we have a very distinguished anthropologist who to speak to us is Professor Anand Pandian. Professor Anand Pandian is professor and department chair of anthropology at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland, USA. He is a recipient of the Infosys Prize in Social Sciences in 2019. He has published quite extensively, and most of his books are actually available in our library. And his most recent book is titled Possible Anthropology Methods for Uneasy Times, published in 2019 with Duke University Press. And there is another interesting book that he has written. It's called IS Accounts, A Ledger of Hope in Modern India. This book, I believe, is jointly co-authored with a fruit vendor. And this book is published by the Indiana University Press in 2014. And it's a detailed account of that fruit vendor's life as told by the fruit vendor himself. Then there is a third book, which is Crooked Stalks, Cultivating Virtue in South India, again published by Duke University Press in 2009. He also serves as a curator of the newly established Ecological Design Collective in Baltimore. And a very warm welcome to Professor Anand Pandian. He was promising to visit us in person. Unfortunately, this virus had upset all our plans. But I suppose he would come again, and whenever he's coming to India, he has promised to come and visit CDS, because we do have colleagues at the moment working on similar kind of issues. We have a younger colleague who is also an anthropologist, and I think we will benefit a lot from the kind of field work-based research that you actually do. Okay, so once again, a very warm welcome to Professor Anand Pandian, and he's going to give us a lecture on a recent work that he's doing, which is called Butterfly Crossings, Environmental Ethics in a World of Multiplying Boards. Okay, and he has written also about this in the popular press. For instance, there was a recent newspaper article in The Guardian, and so on. Okay, so a very warm welcome to you, Professor Anand Pandian, and we look forward to your lecture. You could take about an hour or so. We are not too strict about the timing. Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mani, for this kind introduction and for the kind invitation to join you all this evening. It is truly an honor for me, I have to say. I, really, from as long ago as I can remember, from the moment that I began being interested in social science, in development studies, in anthropology, for as long as I've been reading around these topics, the Kerala model of development, the uniqueness of the development path that has been pursued in Kerala, that was in many ways, of course, pioneered at CDS, has been so much a part of the kind of not only what I learned about, say, in reading in school, in graduate school in particular, where we read many books about Kerala and the Kerala model in classes in development studies, but even more than that, I would say, just in the simple example of the value of some other form of aspiration, the notion that you could pursue development in a very different way, with a different set of commitments, with a different sense of responsibility of what is needed in the world and who it's needed for, and one could do this without having to follow the path that the West had taken in such destructive terms. It was truly inspiring for myself and for generations of younger kind of scholars and writers like myself. And so it really is an honor not only to join you all at CDS, but to join you for this specific occasion in commemorating the life and legacy of Dr. K. and Raj. And I can't promise that in my work and in what I'm going to share with you today, that I'll be able to engage with that legacy and that work very closely, I am an anthropologist, and my methods I think are a little different, perhaps even than many of you at CDS now. But I was very grateful for the invitation from Dr. Money to join you all. And my hope is that in sharing something a little different, we may wind up finding some convergent interests and commitments, and can have a good discussion around some concerns of common interest. So thank you all once again, not only for the chance to join you, but also for tuning in and listening. And again, I will also acknowledge that there's a very awkward way of meeting, so to speak. We had a few minutes to get started because I was having connectivity issues here in my office, and Zoom, WebEx, all these platforms, they have their own conventions. So please do forgive me for that. But we're here now, we're together, and I'm going to basically read from a recent piece that I've been working on that grows out of a project that Dr. Money mentioned, a project on walls, boundaries, and everyday borders in the contemporary United States. It was a project that I began to think about in the wake of the presidential election in 2016, and the real shock that came from the realization that this country was prepared to welcome a business tycoon into the White House, and what's more, to welcome this former president of ours with the promise of building this giant wall between the United States and Mexico, a promise that wasn't simply a kind of policy promise, but was really a symbol of a certain politics and a certain way of being in the world, a certain way of being American as against the world. And so this was something that was really disturbing to so many of us, and I decided to essentially suspend the plans that I had and to begin working on this project, which has slowly been coming together over the last few years. And what I'm going to share with you today is a glimpse of just one small corner of this project, a project on a small corner that concerns migration and hopes to find in the figure of migrants, both human and non-human, a way of thinking against the logic of walls and stark borders between one's own people and other people. So this is the kind of backstory for what I'm going to be sharing with you. I'll also just say a couple of things at the outset. The work that I'm going to share is, let me actually just take a moment to share my screen. Does that look like a full screen video to you all? A full screen image?
Yeah, it is a full screen. Okay.
Okay, good. All right. I'm so sorry. I'm unfamiliar with WebEx. So just to say a couple of things at the very outset, I'm thinking not entirely explicit here, but I'm thinking in relation to certain problems in the field of environmental ethics. And I'm thinking in particular here about relationships with non-human lives and places as the foundation of environmental ethics. But more than that, I'm thinking about a sense of relatedness to those other lives and places as essential in the cultivation of such ethical relationships. Not only the fact of relationship, but a sense of relatedness, a sense of kinship, a sense of connection between our own lives and the lives of other living beings and living places that may not be as directly meaningful to who we are and where we are. And so I'm interested here in forms of being an experience in the world that help to nurture such sense of relatedness. And I'm not simply thinking about that as a kind of objective analysis, as something that I'm trying to make sense of to you, but in fact, to try to put us all in the space of such relatedness, to have us all entertain the meaningfulness of those connections. And the way that I do that is as a storyteller by sharing a series of narratives. The whatever arguments that are at stake in this presentation will really find their body in the form of a series of stories that I'm going to be sharing with you that I hope will give a more vivid and sensory impression of what it is that is at stake in this field of environmental ethics. And I take really seriously the possibility that stories can do a lot of ethical work in and of themselves by helping to forge felt connections between oneself and others. So that I hope will do something by way of explaining the way in which this particular talk, or really I'm reading an essay, the way that it unfolds. Is my pace okay in terms of the pace at which I'm speaking?
Yeah, it's perfectly all right.
Okay, very good. So if I need to change that at all, please feel free to jump in. Happy to do that. Okay. The yellow square was styled like a road sign, warning that something unusual would be coming up. Not a pedestrian or a curved or slippery road, but instead a butterfly. The bold black lines composing the form at its heart suggested a monarch butterfly, an idea borne out by the orange and yellow hue of its wings. But there was something else visible in the patterning, a human face outlined within the wings on either side, drawn in the manner of a Mayan figure. Butterfly crossing, the sign declared. And yet the crossing signaled in the design was much more than a traversal of space. The artwork gestured toward a passage between human and lepidopteran creatures, as if the one could only find its meaning and fulfillment in the other. In recent years, the monarch butterfly has become a ubiquitous symbol in the immigrant rights movements of the United States. Attend a rally for undocumented migrants to the United States in San Diego, Washington, D.C., or any other U.S. city, and you're bound to see countless people with paper wings on their backs, daubed with the monarch's telltale markings in orange and black. Monarchs were painted all over the undocubus that undocumented migrant students, day laborers, and domestic workers took across the country in 2012 for the Democratic National Convention in Charlotte, North Carolina. Spilling out of the bus in t-shirts printed with yet more butterflies, these activists risked arrest and deportation in civil disobedience actions that echoed the freedom rides of the American civil rights movement of the 1960s. The monarch butterfly has patterns of migration that go from Mexico through the United States to Canada and back. Fabiano Rodriguez, an Oakland-based artist who nurtured the symbolism, has observed. It really symbolizes the natural way in which living creatures move and migrate in cycles. They go in certain seasons and they return in others, very similar to what workers do, coming and going for each agricultural harvest, she suggested. One night during the DNC that year in 2012, Rodriguez led a crew of guerrilla artists through the streets of Charlotte, plastering those butterfly crossing signs that she had designed on the scattered walls and street corners, each capped with the slogan and lesson, "Migration is natural." Such gestures remind us that migration is a bedrock reality of earthly life, whether human or otherwise. They ask us to pay heed to the knots of connection that produce a sense of relatedness between human and non-human animals, as Radhika Govindrajan has put it in her recent book, Animal Intimacies. And they invite us to imagine the span of the Americas beginning not with borders and walls, but instead with movement beyond them. If crossings function as contemporary sites of enchantment, then they might play a role in cultivating an ethical sensibility, the philosopher Jane Bennett writes. Their magic might generate what might be called presumptive generosity toward the animals, vegetables, and minerals within one's field of encounter. Traversing a series of such encounters, this essay explores the force of that might. For there remains wonder in such crossings, the chance of being moved by the reality of moving beyond. What might our countries and continents begin to look and feel like if we acknowledge the necessity of these crossings, the kinship and well-being that movement sustains? The story I recount here is a personal one, anchored in experiences that I've pursued as a child of immigrants and a father of brown children growing up in the United States, as much as my work as an anthropologist. But this too is a kind of crossing that we might acknowledge, such passage between the personal and the official, a reality for so many of us whose lives have demanded a dwelling in crossroads. I also want to acknowledge at the very outset here that I'm speaking of a migratory context rather different from contexts that we might encounter in India and in Kerala in particular. But I'm also hoping that there may be some resonances in thinking through what is at stake in these different contexts and situations of migrants, of migration. And perhaps this is, again, something else that we can talk about in the discussion. One could hardly imagine a more suitable ambassador for these endeavors than the monarch butterfly, Danaus plexippus. These are creatures that weigh less than 1 gram, that is, less than a paperclip, a raisin, or a dollar bill, and yet their life cycle takes them on journeys that can span the length of North America, from as far north as the maritime provinces of eastern Canada to the highlands of southern Mexico, where those who survive this epic journey will winter. The monarch is such a fragile, wind-tossed scrap of life, the Canadian zoologist Fred Urquhart noted, one that somehow manages to find its way across prairies, deserts, mountain valleys, even cities. For these delicate beings that dot the margins of so much of the continent's landscapes, crossing vast distances is quite simply a way of life. Where the monarchs of the eastern United States and Canada went each winter remained a mystery to scientists until the 1970s. Small creatures ever fluttering, falling into throngs of dozens or swarms of many thousands, gliding upward on thermals to take currents of air as high as a quarter-mile above ground. Imagine trying to track an individual itinerary. Fred Urquhart and his wife Nora devoted the better part of their lives to resolving this mystery. They developed a technique to tag butterflies with small, lightweight stickers, enlisting thousands of volunteers in scattered places to tag, release, and track the monarchs they found, a pioneering movement in citizen science. The winter destination of the eastern monarchs remained elusive until one fateful January in 1975, when the Urquharts received a phone call from two of their volunteers in Mexico, Catalina Aguado and Ken Brugger. An isolated grove in the Sierra Madre Mountains, more than 10,000 feet above sea level, was encrusted with these butterflies. I gazed in amazement at the sight, Fred Urquhart wrote for National Geographic the following year, when he and Nora trekked themselves to that mountaintop, known as Cerro Pelon. Butterflies, millions upon millions of monarch butterflies. They clung in tightly packed masses in every branch and trunk of the tall, gray-green oyamel trees, he wrote. They swirled through the air like autumn leaves and carpeted the ground in their flaming myriads on this Mexican mountainside. Millions of North Americans were eventually swept into the naturalist movement that the Urquharts inspired. a wave of monarch enthusiasm that touched down in countless places. One of them was the school where both of my children went to elementary school in Baltimore, Maryland. Since the late 1970s, Park School kindergarten classes have held a Monarch Butterfly Festival each fall. Children search the fields nearby for caterpillars, raise them in class, and release the butterflies that emerge from each chrysalis. Gone to Mexico went the note that my son fixed onto one empty case when he was in kindergarten in 2014. He was a butterfly that year in the kindergarten play staged by the children and teachers together, as was my daughter a few years later, in a woodland drama that began and ended with the children singing of the flight that the butterflies would make toward their mountain home in the distant south. At home, all of us knew these words of the songs by heart. We'd planted milkweed in our garden and in our nearby park in Baltimore, served up birthday cake decorated with a monarch drawing, spoken with our children on countless occasions about this mountain home of the butterflies they'd learned so much about. But it wasn't easy to imagine this flight, the many miles and millions in company. Then in January 2019, a couple of months after my daughter's kindergarten festival, we had the privilege of going there ourselves, to the place where scientists had first made this connection between the monarchs of the United States and Canada and their Mexican refuge. Catalina Aguado had appeared on the cover of the National Geographic issue that announced the discovery of the monarchs on Cerro Pelon in 1976. Still, as an avid naturalist, she was ambivalent about the news. I wish everyone in the world had my eyes right now to see what I'm seeing and feel what I'm feeling, she later recalled, about the sensation of being engulfed by those butterflies. But, she also lamented, now there'll be hordes of people here and they'll destroy everything. In the years that followed, the forests that hosted the monarch colonies were declared a protected reserve and made off-limits to the local people who had long depended on them for their livelihood. At the same time, in an irony seen most everywhere that nature tourism takes hold, the region became a magnet for tourists from distant places, a development that made it possible for my family to see these sites firsthand as monarch enthusiasts visiting from the United States. And to take a moment, I just want to clarify, or just to remind us that what I'm trying to do here is to think between, or encourage us to think between the experience of people in motion and other creatures in motion, right? To sort of think about migration as a framework that includes humans and non-humans alike. The Monarch Butterfly Biosphere Reserve lies along the boundary between the states of Michoacan and Mexico, 100 miles northwest of Mexico City. For much of the 20th century, mountain forests and other lands in the region have been managed collectively here as communal properties in the form of ejidos claimed by mestizo communities or comunidades held by indigenous communities. Local access to these forest commons was curtailed with the Mexican government's establishment of a monarch butterfly reserve here in 1980, and then the designation of a UNESCO-sponsored biosphere reserve in the early 2000s. Logging was prohibited, and unofficial presence in the forest was redefined as trespassing, especially during the winter butterfly season. As Columba Gonzalez Duarte has written, such restrictive strategies transform conservation areas into dreamlands for elite consumption, phenomenon, of course, that we see all around India as well. Cerro Pelon is located in the southern reaches of the Biosphere Reserve. The entrance to the sanctuary here is within the pueblo of Macheros, one of 5 villages that make up the Ejido El Capulin. Murals on the walls of the sanctuary's visitor center depict some of this history and its legacies. The stacks of lumber brought down from the mountains by railway and pack animals in past decades. The stables where these animals were corralled here in Macheros. Church of San Isidro de Labrador that remains at the center of the small settlement of 400 people. On another wall of the visitor center is a hand-painted map of North America with no borders to delineate, just 3 national flags that overlap and blend into each other. In 2014, the monarch butterfly was adopted as a symbol for the North American Free Trade Agreement and its promise of transnational cooperation. In places like Macheros, however, the agreement was a dire blow to the local economy, flooding the area with cheap corn from the United States, stealing the market away from local farmers, and driving labor out migration. We saw monarchs flutter now and then down the narrow road snaking through the pueblo when we were there in 2019. The squawk of chickens echoed through the air, as did the clamor of an occasional motorbike or chainsaw. As with many other places in Mexico, the United States felt both very close and very far from here. I met people who had been deported from the United States, and others who said that they'd never been and had no intention to go. Some had work permits to travel north once or twice a year for field labor, planting onions, harvesting blueberries, tending to sweet potatoes, while many others told me that they were thinking of going, but without a plan in mind. One young man I met was weighing all of these options. He said he hoped to make it soon to Phoenix if he could. We stayed at a bed and breakfast established on the land of one of the Pueblo's families. Joel Moreno and some of his brothers had spent many years working in the United States, in landscaping and other trades. Joel opened the lodge in Macheros with his wife Ellen Sharp, an American anthropologist, with tourist revenue becoming a substantial source of income for dozens of local people in the months when the butterflies were here. Otherwise, many households had few options other than illegal logging in the nearby mountains. A few years ago, with this problem in mind, Joel and Ellen started a nonprofit organization called Butterflies and Their People, training local men and women to work as arborists and forest guards in the nearby forest, a paid alternative to logging. Joel's own father, Melquiades, had been employed here as a forest ranger by the state of Mexico for more than 30 years, and when he retired, he ceded the responsibility to Joel's brother, Pato. Visitors from elsewhere who stayed at the lodge had often grown up with the chance to nurture a love of butterflies, tagging and releasing monarchs from distant places, as my own children had done in school. In contrast, in the communities around the reserve, as Ellen Sharp has written, people lived too close to the bone for the luxury of citizen science. Those who found employment as forest stewards had the chance to develop a different perspective on the butterflies in their environment, although international conservation establishments have made little room for the insights that arise from such everyday encounters in Mexico between rural people and butterflies. Sometimes the monarchs land on us to warm themselves up, Pato Moreno recounted in a photo essay he contributed to the Journey North Wildlife Migration blog in 2021. The trove of butterfly photos and videos that Pato had posted online reveals a keen sensitivity for monarch lifeways and small moments of beauty in the forest, bringing him tens of thousands of followers on Facebook. You go into the forest and see the trees, and you think of them as friends who are part of you, Pato observed in an oral history project on the experience of local forest rangers, co-written by Ellen Sharp and Will Wright. Then to see a tree that is cut down is very difficult, and it's sad seeing the forest cut down. Growing up, his brother Joel told me when we met, their grandfather used to advise them not to harm the butterflies, for they were the souls of the dead, spirits of the ancestors who returned each year for the Day of the Dead. No one knew where they came from, only that they always did. The idea is a common one in this part of Mexico, implying that it is here that these creatures truly belong, rather than in the fields and meadows they traverse for most of their lives in the distant north. The summit of Cerro Pelon soars more than 3,000 feet above the hillside village of Macheros, slung onto a slope of the Sierra Madre Occidental. Paths up the mountain are steep and demanding. We took horses, guided by men from the pueblo. We passed through mixed forests of oak and other broadleaf trees, boles carpeted with moss and creepers. Now and then, in the stands of pine, you would see half a plastic bottle fixed below a gash in a tree trunk, collecting the resin that slowly seeped out, attesting to other ways that people sought a living here. Occasional stumps were reminders of the logging that locals sometimes relied on in the absence of other means of livelihood. Amidst this verdant mass of montane vegetation, the monarchs sought out the Oyamel fir, Abies religiosa, a native conifer found in isolated groves in the higher reaches of this forest. It was a good season for butterflies when we visited in 2019, maybe thrice as many as the year before. As we ascended the mountain, we found more and more of them gliding along the trails. On clear and cloudless days like this one, the monarchs drift widely, seeking out patches of sunshine, warmth. We came across a clearing where thousands flitted overhead, arcing toward the ground to drink from the dew, from the nectar of the wildflowers. It was a moment for slack-jawed wonder. I've never seen so many butterflies, my son blurted out, watching them pass overhead. Look to the sky and you'd see them come down like autumn leaves, flecks of orange and yellow drifting from the branches in the distance, bright spots of color run through with darker veins. The analogy made sense until you noticed that it didn't quite work, for they were doing more than falling to the ground like leaves, instead making slight turns and pirouettes to remain in the air. All of us kept fumbling for words to make sense of what we saw. This vision of an entire world alight with fiery sparks, the fullness of a landscape come alive with butterflies. It's like a highway, they're zooming past me, my son marveled. One of the guides from Machero straddled the path and closed his eyes, holding both his arms outstretched as if to welcome whatever might pass his way. They come like a river, he mused. I couldn't help but think about xenophobic tropes of anti-immigrant sentiment we'd been hearing in the United States, about the floods of migrants pouring into that country. Here, they truly flowed through the air around us. I hope one lands on my finger, my daughter said, gingerly holding out a hand. Just about 6 at the time, she'd been a little uneasy at first about the clouds of butterflies swooping about us. These were, after all, swarms of insects, however elegant the patterns on their wings may be. But it helped to focus on individual creatures, to look more closely at the ones that were resting, the markings on their wings, the shape of the proboscis, the small parts that might have gone missing during their arduous journey here. We walked carefully through the clearing for some time, trying not to step on any butterflies underfoot. You could feel them in the air around us, the susurration of countless wings thrumming through the sunshine. We climbed for another hour by horseback, then hiked the final length to the firs where the monarchs clustered. I'm tired from the walk, my daughter complained. I tried some parental banter. We're almost there. See the butterflies here? Think about how far they came. They came thousands of miles to get here. They didn't ride horses. They didn't take an airplane. Nobody gave them a lift. They came here on their own. My daughter fixed me a look when I said all this, weary of the wonder she was being asked to feel. Your saying that just makes me more tired, she retorted. Up ahead was the heart of the colony. It isn't easy to describe how the branches of the OML trees looked overhead, hanging low with these heaping clumps of insects. You could say that they looked like dark bunches of grapes, the thousands of butterflies clustered onto each branch. Look more closely then, and you would see the sharp lines of their wings, like orange crystals, pulsing atop the bristly green needles. Now and then, when the wind picked up, the trees would creak and groan with the load they carried. Sometimes, the guide said, the wood just snaps from the weight of the butterflies. Here we were at last, in the mountain home of the monarchs. My son and daughter speculated about whether any of the butterflies released by her kindergarten class had made it here. The journey was fraught with so much uncertainty. The kids knew how hard it would be to say. The dirt at our feet was littered with dead and dying butterflies, and the children were obsessively drawn to those still twitching and skipping from the ground. Is it going to die? They kept asking. You could feel it, the exhausting burden of getting here, surviving. I talked for a while with a forest ranger posted to the site. He too had worked for a couple of years in the United States at a metal fabrication workshop in Wisconsin. Too cold, he said, shivering at the thought of it. We stood together, gazing at the butterflies swarming above us, marveling at the idea of such tiny creatures coming from so far. Indocumentado, without papers, I quipped. Without visas, he added with a laugh, gesturing with his hand to show how easily they'd sailed across that distant border. Monarchs are celebrated for their migration, but it isn't simply how far they go, year after year. There's also the astonishing fact of their convergence, their ability to find each other at a time when national borders govern the movement of individual human bodies so forcefully, disrupting family ties and relationships. While the core area of the Monarch Butterfly Reserve in southern Mexico spans about 52 square miles, the butterflies congregate in just a few tiny patches within this region. In the winter of 2018-19, researchers identified 14 colonies of monarch butterflies, occupying a total area of just 6 hectares. It was in those minuscule tracts that butterflies ranging over nearly 2 million square miles of North America would gather, rest, and breed, as many as 300 million of them in those 6 hectares that season. Biologists have yet to establish how these small creatures find their way to these spots, given the profound distances they must traverse. No one monarch makes its way to Mexico more than once in its life, and several generations pass, in fact, in the slow transit northward once again, meaning that each butterfly that lands in Mexico is many generations removed from those that had been here before. Monarchs carry a compound called magnetite in their bodies, and some scientists have suggested that they orient themselves and plot a direction in relation to the Earth's magnetic field. The puzzle remains unresolved, an occasion for avid speculation. There's a dust that falls from the scale on their wings, our driver assured me, arguing that it was this substance that guided the butterflies here, that passed on knowledge of this place between generations. Roberto and I were crouching over a small rivulet when he said this, watching monarchs flit down to alight on rocks and branches beside the water. We were in the Sierra Chinqua sanctuary, another crucial gathering ground for the butterflies about 20 miles north of Macheros, near the historic mining town of Angangueo. The American Smelting and Refining Company mined silver and lead here for many decades of the 20th century, until the mines were nationalized by Mexico after a catastrophic accident in 1953. A Mexican mining concern is planning now to reopen the mines, a possibility that greatly alarms monarch enthusiasts, for two of their most significant refuges, El Rosario and Sierra Chinqua, are in forests on the periphery of the town. Roberto had driven us here in a white sedan he had recently purchased. A man of compact height and pleasant demeanor, for the last several years he'd been traveling back and forth to a small town in central Wisconsin, where he worked as a farm laborer, looking after sweet potatoes. He would leave by bus each April, return for a few weeks each August, then leave again for Wisconsin, where he would work through December. He and his wife had 2 daughters, one just 9 months old. The baby had a serious problem with one of her legs and likely needed surgery. It would be some time before Roberto could pass up this difficult labor itinerary, leaving his family year after year in order to ensure their care. We learned from Roberto that he was also a cantante, a singer, as we took the narrow, winding road down the mountainside from Macheros. He picked up his phone to pull up YouTube, which I did for him so he could keep his hands on the steering wheel. It turned out that he was the lead singer of a banda musical ensemble. They made several albums, and they would tour whenever he came back to Mexico from his work as a farm laborer in Wisconsin. The videos they had posted online were slick, professional productions, shot in fancy locales and edited with dramatic verve. Roberto alternatively crooning on a stage with his band members, or playing a role in the stories these songs told of amorous betrayals and clandestine romance. You could find him in an opulent hotel suite with a beautiful young woman, with a goblet of wine at an elegant restaurant, lounging with children in the living room of a palatial home. We were astounded by these spectacles, having driven right past the modest house and fields his family shared. When I praised the fine look he sported in the videos, always in gleaming shoes, finely tailored shirts, and slacks, Roberto shrugged and grinned. I couldn't square it. Behind the wheel of the sedan, he was wearing jeans and a Buffalo Bills sweatshirt. Perhaps the only clue to his other life was the cowlick curling atop his head, some small marker of a clandestine defiance. "You're my secret adventure," went the refrain to one of these songs, and the line stayed with us all day as we traveled to Sierra Chinqua. "We all have fantasies and dreams," Roberto later said on our way back from the reserve. "That's what it means to be a human being." I couldn't help but think about the American dream, el sueño americano, as Roberto put it, an aspiration that he, like so many others in Mexico, knew well. Far more important to him, however, was what he called the Mexican dream, el sueño mexicano. This dream, he said, would be to live in Mexico and have enough work to survive, enough to live well with your family, not to go to the United States. That's my Mexican dream, to have a good job here, but this would be a fantasy. That's why we leave. That year in Wisconsin, Roberto would earn $13 an hour, 25 cents more than the year before. And until he headed north that April, he would seek work here however he could. His phone started to ring, in fact, just as our conversation began to dive more deeply into these philosophical matters of dream and aspiration. He apologized for taking the call. It was another small chance at work, before dropping us off on one of the cobbled roads that snake through Angangeo. Painted onto the wall of a nearby playground was a cluster of monarch butterflies, flitting around the image of a young girl. There were long red ribbons that dangled from her pigtails, and a pair of wings in orange and black, sprouting from her back. I began thinking in earnest about the boundaries that framed the United States in the fall of 2016. My own parents emigrated to the United States from India in 1972, and my siblings and I were born and raised in this country. For us, as for countless other immigrant families, this was home. And yet, with the 2016 presidential campaign, the question of whether we truly belonged here snapped into sharper focus than at any other moment in my lifetime. Again and again, people we knew, my own father too, were accosted by a stranger with that taunt, "Go back to your own country." The idea of the border wall was an embodiment of this harsh nativist politics, and I began pursuing ethnographic fieldwork around the United States to try to understand why this idea appealed to so many Americans. And this is a recent piece that Dr. Money had mentioned that was published in The Guardian earlier this year in January that summarizes in some ways this work that I've been doing. You'll be able to find it online if you look. At the migrant rights rallies I attended, meanwhile, I was struck by the way that activists had mobilized the image of the butterfly as a powerful rejoinder to this border politics, conjuring a more expansive and generous picture of American belonging. They struggled against divisions that had deepened and intensified over many years. The border between the United States and Mexico begins in the west as a towering row of high steel posts sunk into the waters of the Pacific Ocean. This place, where San Diego County meets Tijuana, is still known as Friendship Park, inaugurated by First Lady Pat Nixon in 1971. At the time, no more than a wire fence divided the countries here, and families and friends would gather together on both sides for reunions, church services, even yoga. The wire fence later gave way to a high steel mesh barrier, then a second, parallel set of bars on the US side. Eventually, people were allowed into the no man's land between these two fences for just a few hours each weekend day to approach the mesh and greet their loved ones as best they could. Beside me on the US side of the border one Sunday morning in 2017 was a young woman who had lived in the United States for most of her life. She'd brought her newborn daughter, dressed with a pink bow and a polka dot onesie, to meet the child's grandfather, a man stuck on the other side. Jose Marquez had lived with his wife and children in the United States for 18 years, until he was deported in 2002. Each month he came to Friendship Park to see what he could of his Mexican-American family. Looking into Tijuana, you could hardly make out the elderly man through the dense latticework of the barrier. Still, the sound of his guitar carried through the bars as he serenaded his newborn granddaughter in Spanish across the bars. Aunque digas que me odias, although you tell me that you hate me, he sang. I know this can't be true. It's the look on your face that says it. You're still crying for me. He was singing to the child across the fence, and yet it seemed that in singing of a real need that was nevertheless disavowed, he was also speaking to the country that kept them apart. Later that afternoon, on the Mexican side of Friendship Park, I met a young man who had grown up on the outskirts of Phoenix. His parents had brought him from Mexico to Arizona when he was 2 months old. Then, when he was 16, a white kid working at the same pizzeria called him into Homeland Security as an illegal alien. They were in love with the same girl, it turned out, and deportation was one way to resolve the impasse. Carlos was looking now at those same high steel bars, contemplating a crossing. The bars themselves on the border fence look very different depending on whether you stand on the American or the Mexican side. In the United States, what you see is a stark and imposing barrier, something that looms like a penitentiary stronghold. But in Tijuana, the same steel posts are a riot of color and words, painted by muralists and laced with messages of both frustration and aspiration, the testimony of those exiled from the United States and others seeking to kindle the imagination. The bars fade at times into a semblance of blue skies and verdant shrubs, as if you could see the landscape on the other side, as if the binational garden truly does spill across the divide and toward the horizon beyond. The border fence is built as a series of vertical lines of steel, but because these bars are triangular in form, they allow for visual tricks. Walk east along the border, again on the Mexican side, and you'll see a flag that combines the American stars and stripes with a Mexican motif of green, white, and red. But then circle back and walk west along the same fencing, and what you'll see instead is an image painted in strips onto a different face of these triangular bars, one that reveals a giant monarch butterfly perched upon bright red petals. It's almost as though this flitting creature is a rejoinder to these weighty posts planted into the earth, a living reminder that things will move no matter how much we fix them in place. So much of the alarm over trespassed borders, Toni Morrison has observed, ensues from an uneasy relationship with our own foreignness, our own rapidly disintegrating sense of belonging. Can we learn to live again with a greater sense of mutual implication, to tend to such awareness as the foundation of our social lives? Completely open borders are a difficult proposition, both politically and socially. But so much seems to turn on the nature of those edges between the familiar and the foreign, on the possibility of conceiving these boundaries as porous thresholds rather than hard divides. So, one final section to conclude before we turn into discussion. People dream of butterflies, yes, but do butterflies dream? Entomologists still know so little about the sleep of insects, let alone the more tenuous states of consciousness they may drift into. The monarchs wintering in Mexico fall into a lengthy state of quiescence, a reproductive torpor, as the renowned monarch biologist Lincoln Brower has put it, that allows them to survive for months on accumulated fat and occasional sips of water. The canopy of the Oyamel firs serves as a blanket to protect from rain, heat, and cold, Brower writes. And the trunks where they cluster are like hot water bottles, he writes, under that insulating cover, radiating enough heat at night to prevent the butterflies from freezing in those upland temperatures. Blanket, bottle, and bed. These may be human accessories of little concern to an arthropod. Still, there's no doubt that what the monarchs make here is something of a home. It may not be very comforting to imagine home from the perspective of an insect. If anything, the places where they teem, ants and bees, roaches and grubs, come to mind as allegories of mindless work or dank decay, not as refuges from the troubles of the world. In fact, if insects surface in the thought of home, they do so, for the most part, as evidence of infestation. And yet we share this world and continent alike with them. It is worth pausing for this reason to think more about what refuge might look and feel like for bugs like butterflies, what accounts for the well-being that they, like we, seek. If there's one thing that stands out about the forest groves that comprise the mountain home of the monarch butterflies in the Mexican Sierra Madre, it is the absence of walls. No boundary looms between one and another, between each butterfly and the world beyond. Yet there are other necessary structures of support. In the heights of the oyamel firs, boles, branches, and the bodies of other butterflies serve to brace and support. When monarchs cluster like this by the millions, they make a more livable microclimate for each other, one with less fluctuations of heat and cold, one to safeguard the life-giving resource of humidity. These refuges afford safety and security by putting each butterfly in the company of others, rather than by ensuring the absence of those others. There is shelter and protection in this company. These colonies seem less to occupy a sprawling interior bedroom than a grand arboreal porch, a city of migrants in the heights. It remains to be seen how durable these living arrangements will be. The monarchs of North America have seen a steep decline in numbers over time. Logging in the Monarch Butterfly Reserve has accelerated during these years of the coronavirus pandemic, as sanctuaries have closed to visitors and the international tourist economy has crashed. A leading environmental activist and a tour guide were found dead near the El Rosario Sanctuary just a few years apart in 2020. Their violent demise possibly linked to powerful cartels operating in the region. The North American drug trade and the booming export market for avocados from the region have fueled both violence and deforestation. Climate change will also pose a serious problem in the long run. The climatic zone most hospitable to the oyama firs is slowly moving as the atmosphere warms, and some scientists speculate that by the end of this century, these trees will only be found beyond the present boundaries of the reserve. These boundaries remind us that the mountain refuge of the monarchs is a space without walls in only one specific sense. The Monarch Butterfly Biosphere Reserve was established with a conservation model that relies on border security and spatial restriction, securing a habitat for wildlife alone in a manner analogous to the nationalist politics that define particular countries as the proper homeland of certain people but not others. These exclusionary policies have much to do with the violence and other serious challenges that the reserve has faced, Columba Gonzalez Duarte observes. By converting a commons, she writes, that was governed through communal institutions into a protected area free of people, the policy ironically created a situation that was less able to protect humans, OML trees, and butterflies. The best hope for these forests may lie, as Gonzalez Duarte and Manuel Ureste suggest, in the indigenous communities that have mobilized locally to defend them in the name of mutual necessity. In the United States and Canada, meanwhile, the butterflies face other grave concerns. Monarch caterpillars are truly border creatures by nature, relying on the milkweeds found on the edges of agricultural fields, roads, and pastures for their sustenance and survival. Among our industrial crops, like the maize and soybeans that carpet the Midwest of the United States, milkweeds are unneeded and unheeded, plants out of place, weeds. In the last decade, chemical herbicides have largely eliminated milkweeds from vast tracts of land. Chemical pesticides also attack caterpillars directly, and the disappearance of wildflowers from human landscapes makes it more difficult for butterflies to gather the nectar that fuels their transnational flights. In all these ways, the monarchs are also victims of our society's intolerance for those who don't properly belong, lives dismissed as useless and out of place. Their fate reminds us that a world of stark lines between inside and out is a toxic one, especially for those caught in between. For these migratory butterflies, as for the human migrants they are often taken to symbolize, it is misleading to speak of borders as somehow simply closed, or imagine them as open instead. When life depends on movement across boundaries, such movement is inevitable. The question is whether these boundaries are arranged in a manner hospitable to this need for movement. With the lifeways of the monarch butterfly, The most crucial lesson has to do with the relationships that propel movement across borders, the ties that draw together those within and those without. A society of walls may seek to repudiate their reality or their necessity, and yet these relationships remain at work in our world of pervasive movement, motion, and migration, binding our fates together, whether we know it or not, like it or not, with living beings and distant places far beyond the span of the lines we draw. These are ties that demand acknowledgement. They are relations that deserve care, and they can teach us something essential about the difficult task of taking down the walls we've raised. Walls between those at home and others who remain in search of one, between those within a sheltering cocoon and the others who walk exposed beside them, between those who tend with care to their own and the others left to forage as best they can. There's much to learn in following the threads of these many relations between inside and out, the debts to a world beyond that line every construction of a world within. For we cannot live without those beings and elements we might like to ignore, those we fear and want to wall out, the people who build our homes and grow our food, the things let seep into the water we drink, the heat building up in the air we breathe. Like it or not, our fates are bound up with all such things. I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Pandian. Do you mind taking a few questions?
Happy to.
Okay. So the floor is open now, and you could just unmute yourself and ask your questions to Professor Pandian. Or if you are not able to do that, you could put your question in the chat box, and I will read that out for Professor Pandian.
I see Varun had a question.
Hi. May I go, sir? May I ask?
Yes,
May I
yes,
speak?
please.
Yeah. Thank
Yeah,
you, Mani,
please.
sir. Yeah. Thank you, Anand, for matlab, it was like I was going through the journey which you had showed us, and we were looking at how the human interventions, conflicts with the nature what we understood. So, and here I think you have shown to us about a journey of a butterflies, about what I understood from your lecture. I hope I've understood it correctly. About the journey of a butterflies and how the human interventions have affected the survival of them. So this is about, if we look at, it is about I just wanted to know what is the perspective of the people who are living in that region. Is it that they are sympathetic? Is it that they want to matlab, work for, survival of these species? What is, in environmental, we also have something, some experiments being done about in the region about what would you like for the preservation of these species. So any thoughts you have on this or any experiences you're aware of? Thank you, sir.
Yeah,
That's my
yeah.
question.
Thank you so much for that question, Varun. It's a really important question. Because in a sense, the feelings that people have for the non-human beings they share their lives with, or at least the place of their lives with, has an enormous amount to do with the well-being of that larger living matrix that surrounds us. And one of the basic foundations of any thinking around environmental or ecological ethics is the idea that without attention, without forms of relation, and more specifically, without ways in which forging a connection between our human lives and these other lives in a way that's mutually sustaining, ultimately there'll be no way of genuinely creating space for the flourishing of other lives beyond our own. Right? You need both an awareness of that larger matrix of life as well as practical forms of relationship that accommodate the possibility that my well-being is bound up with the well-being of those others. The interesting thing about about butterflies in particular, about these butterflies in particular, is that they are truly migratory creatures. They're always on the move. So even the question of what people feel about them depends on where we are thinking from. Are we thinking from these mountain forests where those who make it cluster for a few months, sort of to breed? Are we thinking about all the places they pass through on their journeys north and south? Are we thinking about the place where they where their caterpillars emerge and the relationship with the host plants, these milkweed that they depend on essentially to grow and mature in those places? There are countless relationships that are at stake when you're speaking of a creature that ranges for its life cycle over literally thousands of miles. And so the answer is very complicated. It's very complicated and difficult, right? So in the United States and Canada, for example, you have these movements, these sort of movements for butterfly conservation, these enthusiasts, these naturalist networks, people in all kinds of places, including my own neighborhood, who are planting milkweed, trying to attract butterflies, raising them, releasing them with this imagination that they have a kind of fate beyond. But we're all bound up in an industrial production system, an industrial agricultural system that doesn't give a whit, and that is systematically eradicating the very possibility for these creatures to survive by destroying the kind of border habitats that they depend on for this life cycle. So we live in the United States and Canada with a profound contradiction. We have a kind of personal attachment to these creatures. We imagine them as kin, and it's very easy to do that. But the industrial matrix of our lives is deadly to their well-being, right? And this is a kind of contradiction that you see again and again in the space of conservation. You have charismatic creatures that attract people for particular ways, but the actual texture of their lives is very different. A similar kind of thing in a different way is you find in Mexico, where you have the development of these tourist networks that bring all these enthusiasts, ourselves included, to these places. And you have the development of tourist economies that are founded on the idea of giving people a stake in the well-being of those creatures. But again, those are predicated on exclusionary forms of conservation that have restricted the access of local people to the environments that they depend on, and do in fact propagate a great deal of resentment. So when these reserves were founded in the 1980s and then and developed into the Biosphere Reserve in the 2000s, people were actually burning down patches of forest as a way of protesting restrictions on their use of land. And so it's a very kind of complicated situation. And in many ways, I think the ultimate question of whether or not the species has a viable future will depend on the cultivation of precisely what you're talking about: viable relationships, viable economic foundations for an interrelationship between people and these migratory species. And in some ways, I would say it is in fact that sense of a species that has needs but is under threat that has a lot to do with why it's been taken up as a symbol of migrants under threat in the same way.
Thank you very much. I am from Pune, and Pune has few nature spots, like we have Pashan Lakes where we heard migratory birds come in. So your talk has encouraged me to connect with the nature, connect with these species, and try to save them, give them an environment to survive. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Varun. We have two questions in the chat box, one from Umar and the other from Ajit Menon, I suppose. Can you read them, or should I read it out for you?
I can read them. So the first question is a methodological question. a post-human critique of the contemporary US seems problematic precisely because it's coming from an Indic position. An Indic pantheistic vision of post-humanism is self-defeating because of its non-existent ethical foundation. If you look at the caste and religious divides in today's India, the crises in the US call for a reframing, not in terms of post-human pantheistic benevolence, but a more rigorous Judeo-Christian ethos of humanism. That is a fascinating challenge. Umar, are you here somewhere? I can't see you. That is a very, very interesting challenge. What I hear, and if I'm understanding correctly, the position that Umar is taking in this, it's I would say it's almost a critique, and I welcome it, is to ask the question, what are the traditions that what are the ethical, moral, spiritual, religious traditions? Sorry? Sorry. Okay. What are the traditions that might anchor an environmental ethics, right? From where do we think around these questions? Is it simply a question to think back to what Varun was just saying? Is it simply just a question of going to places of natural beauty and striking up, I don't know, hanging out with other creatures? Is that what it's about? How do we get there? From where do we get there? And of course, all of us inherit traditions. We don't come to these positions from a vacuum. We carry with us legacies of different kinds. My first book, which was based on fieldwork that I did in rural Tamil Nadu in the between 2000 and 2002, it essentially made the case that there are ways of thinking around the kind of there are ways of thinking through the moral character of cultivation, of agrarian cultivation, that people take very seriously even now in rural Tamil Nadu, that owe a great deal to the medieval ethical traditions embodied in texts like the Tirukkural and other works that still echo in the proverbs and metaphors and other ways in which people imagine what it means to lead a good life, many of which actually have really fascinating natural symbolism working through them. People are constantly imagining in very creative ways what it means to lead a good life as a human being in relation to these details and textures of the rural environment. This is something I've written a great deal about. So this question that Umar poses as to the traditions from which one thinks through these possibilities is a really important one. I'm not sure, personally speaking. I don't know if like there are terms here that one could be thinking about. Like, are we like pantheism would be the idea of a kind of world suffused with divinity or spirituality? Is it that? Is it, as he says instead, as they say instead, an ethic that grows out of a kind of Judeo-Christian humanism? I don't know. I think that the argument being made here in this post is that one needs an ethical foundation that is capable of building connections across differences and divides. I believe that is what is being said in this point, which I agree with completely. But I think resources for that kind of connection, ways of imagining those connections, are actually quite substantial. I think you find them in very different kinds of traditions, and one doesn't necessarily have to go to one place. And my inclination as an anthropologist is to begin with the traditions that people are thinking and working with themselves. So it's very interesting, for example, with regard to the monarch butterfly, that people in Mexico have this this way of celebrating the return of the souls of the dead each year with the Day of the Dead, which we celebrate in the United States as Halloween, and that people for a long time have imagined these butterflies to carry with them those souls. That's an interesting tradition. It's an interesting legacy. I think there are all kinds of legacies of this kind, inheritances that allow us to broach this idea of kinship and connection in very different ways. So that's my thought on that question. Can I go to the next one then? Is that, or should we take an audio question before we go to the next comment? Does someone else have a spoken question? Shall I just go on? Yeah?
Yes,
Yeah.
I think you
Okay.
should. Oh.
So, Ajit, it's so wonderful to know that you're here. Thank you so much for being here. So Ajit writes, was wondering whether a different animal, like the tiger, for example, that migrates less and has more problematic relations with humans, would tell a different story about migration in the future. We can imagine, absolutely, right? Absolutely. And I think the point to make here is that it's not that, I mean, sure, for whatever series of historical accidents, uh, in a very personal, at a very personal level, um, I and my family fell into certain everyday attachments to monarch butterflies. Just, I don't know, it just kind of happened in a way that sometimes happens for us, right? People get very attached to pets or particular species that they follow. They become very interested in for whatever reason. But that's not why I wrote this paper. I wrote this paper because in wrestling with the politics of borders, border walls, of immigration restrictions, and a really xenophobic assertion of the need to kind of divide the world between us and them that we found gaining so much momentum in the United States. Frankly, in India as well, I'll say, as in many other countries around the world in recent years, in wrestling with the toxic consequences of that politics, I began to see the prominence of this particular species as a form of political critique, right? So I'm writing about border politics, I'm thinking about why it is that people are so attached to this binary way of drawing lines between themselves and others, white conservative Americans in particular, go to these immigration rallies, and I keep seeing these butterflies. So what's going on here? So why is it that if the border wall is such a powerful symbol of nationalist exclusion in the United States to the point where it can take someone into the White House, that this other creature stands as a symbol, a powerful symbol, a recurrent symbol that serves as a rejoinder to that politics? That's why I started thinking and writing around the butterfly, right? Because it's doing this work in our cultural and political lives, right? So the answer, Ajit, I would say, is to kind of like begin with the work that these creatures are doing in our human world. So rather than just thinking about the tiger as such, one might think, for example, about, I don't know, like the LTTE, right? Why were they liberation tigers to begin with, right? Why the Black Panthers in the United States? There are all kinds of affinities between humans and other creatures that do a great deal of political work. What is at stake there, and to what extent can we draw connections between the work that they're doing as symbols and as metaphors in our human worlds and the way that they actually live, or our imagination of how they live? I think that's the kind of thing that I'm interested in here.
Okay, there is now again one more in the chat box by G Jax.
Sure. And if anyone wants to kind of jump into this discussion in response to that, I mean, Ajit, I see you're here. I mean, if you have any thoughts on that in response, happy to hear them. I can also keep going. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. And I mean, I see what you're saying, and I mean, it was fascinating. I was just trying because I've been working in areas where you have sort of other histories and other stories which develop in relation to animals. It was in that sense I posed it, but yeah, I agree. I mean, the butterfly is different in the sense that it flies over walls. It's not really disturbed by boundaries. It's not controversial in a sense, right? You don't have butterfly, I guess, human conflict in the way that you might with other animals. So it was just in that sort of spirit I was trying to think through it. But yeah, I mean, it was really, I mean, I really enjoyed, and the political project really uh, that is much needed. So it was just in that spirit that I was trying to engage.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that, Ajit. And I will just actually just say that it's precisely because butterflies sail over these boundaries so easily that they have actually, I mean, on the one hand, they've been celebrated for that movement by migrant rights activists, but on the other hand, they can also serve as figures of consternation. So I have literally run across people writing about how using the making the case that we need butterfly nets across along the border to catch these human migrant butterflies. So they can actually become a figure of fear as well, precisely because they move so easily. That's happening in the United States, if you see what I'm saying, Ajit.
Yeah.
They do carry those resonances as well, which is interesting, and maybe that gets in part to what you're talking about. But your larger point about the specificity of this means a great deal. And for those of you who don't know her work, Radhika Govindrajan's book, Animal Intimacies, is a brilliant instantiation of what Ajit is saying here, because what she does in that book, and this is based on work in North India, in the Himalayan foothills of Uttarakhand, and she shows how the specific nature of particular relationships to particular animals shapes the particular forms of sentiment and feeling that people have around those animals, whether they're bears or goats or cows or monkeys or whatever, right? So there are ways to think around this. There's a question from Mala.
An-
Oh, sorry,
Anand,
go ahead.
I
Yeah.
think Ravi Raman would like to ask a question,
Yes.
and then of course you have Aishwarya Padmaraj, and then number of people in the chat box.
Thanks, Mani. Thank you so much, Anand, for your wonderful presentation. It's very interesting. I find it really interesting. But I think I'm a bit confused. You know, when you use this metaphor, I mean, with respect to these two places, particularly, I mean, Mexico and the USA. But suppose you take the migration conflicts between, say, other Central American countries like, say, Honduras, or say, for instance, El Salvador or Guatemala. People moving from those places to Mexico first and then trying to cross border to the United States. So this particular metaphor, you know, that you are talking about, I mean, from Mexico to the United States, I'm not sure whether this would be equally relevant when someone wanted to talk about the human migration from the other peripheries to Mexico. That's one question I thought I would ask, because I thought I would ask about the limitations of using certain metaphors. Of course, it is again in connection with the Ajit's question, you know, with respect to tiger. So, because these are very two different types of power relations. The power relation between Mexico and the USA, completely different from the power relations between Honduras or El Salvador or Guatemala and Mexico. That's one thing I thought I would ask. The second thing is that, you know, if you look at the history of anthropology, and if you find, you know well better than me, I'm not an anthropologist, sorry. I mean, most of these anthropologists, right from Evans Pritchard to, I mean, the recent authors, you know, they continue to shift the metaphors, you know, in order to explain the same kind of situations in a better manner. So I wonder whether you also think about the limits in applying this metaphor when you look at different power configurations, power relations within the global scape. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for these questions and observations. Let me say a couple things. First of all, I would say in general terms, metaphors and symbols are both powerful and dangerous. They're dangerous because they're so powerful, right? When we make arguments in the form of metaphors or symbols, we're basically relying on the force of an image. We're relying on the way that certain images can seize hold of our imaginations, right? They change the way that we see the world. And this is precisely what is so frightening about how easily this idea of a wall did this work in the United States. It did an enormous amount of political work, right? And when we see that happening, we look at other metaphors that are at work, and this is as much the case in India's political environment as it is really anywhere in the world, right? We have, especially in this age of social media, we have a kind of image-based politics that really relies on the way in which particular images, I'm using image as a way of thinking around metaphor and symbol, the way that particular images seize hold of our imaginations, win our consent like that. Right? There's a kind of short circuit, and those of us who are in the business of making arguments in words and like carefully laying out in more rational terms, a methodical set of laying out evidence why one should take one position as opposed to another and draw this distinction, draw that distinction, we're often cut out of the picture when we find how powerfully these images work, right? So I want to acknowledge that on the one hand. On the other hand, I also want to make the case that we need to be thinking better about this on the left. And I say this thinking in part about India, but also about the United States. I think that it is quite possible that right-wing nationalist politics in a variety of situations has perhaps made more avid and effective use of organizing images. And I don't know, I think that, and a lot of people have written around this question, and I think that it's especially for those of us who are concerned with more difficult forms of political commitment, things that are much harder to say or convince people of, the more radical forms of change, for example, that it might take to really build commitments to social and environmental justice into the texture of our modern lives. How do we get there? I think we need to be wrestling with the power of images more effectively. All right. But I recognize that there's a danger in that. I want to acknowledge that. Specifically with regard to what you said, I take the point about Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, and you're right to make that, to draw that distinction. There are a couple of things to keep in mind here. First, so much of the unrest, the civil unrest, the everyday violence that has driven migration from those three countries into the United States has to do with the ongoing legacies of American intervention in those countries, with the destabilization of democratic governments, with the sale of arms, with the monopolization of economies by American companies, the stripping of land holdings from ordinary people. I mean, the United States has an enormous amount to do with the forms of destabilization that have driven labor outmigration from those three countries to the United States in the last few decades. So part of the challenge here is to try to find a way to think beyond some imagination of the country itself as a hermetic seal. Like people think that you can just secure your own country without having to think about its interconnection with these other places. We have a lot of trouble with that in the United States. So part of the challenge here is to try to find ways of making that connection palpable, making people, bringing into awareness the fact that no country is an island, no country is a bubble. And even if you imagine yourself that way, you're still doing things in other places that have profound effects on those other people. But specifically in regard to the butterfly, then I think that the question has to do with what we might call circular migration, right? And I think that part of the challenge with the more rigid politics of border enforcement that we've had in the United States in recent decades is it's deterred people from moving back and forth. You had long-standing patterns in many of these countries of people moving back and forth in a regular manner, not only pursuing livelihoods, but also taking care of their own more effectively because their families are split between places. And when the borders are enforced the way they are now, it becomes a lot harder. And people have to make choices between being here and being there. And it creates all these other ripple effects. So one value of the butterfly as a metaphor in relation to that is to encourage attention to the importance of moving back and forth. That's a lot that I've said here, but I hope that helps.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We could take one question from the chat box.
Sure.
Professor Mala, could you read that?
And I'll also say, Dr. Money, that I'm happy to keep talking if people want to stay on. I'm happy to keep discussing because these are all wonderful questions.
Yes.
So whenever we can go as long as you want.
Yes. So
Dr.
we
Mala
have,
says,
yes.
shall I read the question? Yeah.
Yes.
Public health professionals have taken to One Health notions of linking the environment to health of populations in contrast to the colonial legacy of segregating humans and animals in their spheres. Does this work in the political and economic environment in which borders are fenced but crossings are inevitable? You know, that is a very fascinating question. And that idea of One Health is something that's being propagated even in my own institution. I'm a professor at Johns Hopkins University. Our School of Public Health, our School of Medicine, they're big proponents of this idea of One Health. And it's true that, you know, thinking of things in a kind of global frame is one way of asserting a connection. Some of you may have seen the op-ed that I published in The Hindu in the spring of 2020. It was the 50th anniversary of Earth Day at the same time that the pandemic was picking up. And I wrote an op-ed for The Hindu called Staying at Home on Planet Earth, in which I was meditating on this idea of one Earth, which is, you know, of course, related to this idea of One Health. I think it takes us to a certain extent, but only so far, because that is a scale that is very hard to fathom. You know, I think like thinking of things, inviting people to kind of think of things in purely global terms is very difficult. It's very difficult to kind of enter in seriousness into relations at that scale. So in a paper like this and in projects of the kind that I've been involved in, I guess what I'm more interested in are border crossings at a smaller scale, like at less of a grand scale. Instead of saying, because in truth there isn't one health. There are many healths because the environment is variegated, people's life circumstances variegated. There are real differences that organize the distinctions between the way in which certain people live, other people live, certain non-human creatures live or survive, and others do as well. And we need to be attentive to those differences as well. And one way to attend to those differences is not to kind of scale up to a global imagination, but instead to follow more local forms of crossing, which is what I'm interested in here.
Okay. We could take a question from Aishwarya Patmaraj and then Professor Harilal. Aishwarya?
Hello, Professor Pandian, can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
I wanted to ask you, with this sort of, idea of like a co-sharing, a co-collaborating within a larger environment where butterflies and humans cross borders in particular ways. I was wondering what happens. Capitalism and industrial agriculture have their own arthropod collaborators, right? Take locusts, for example, who depend on monocultures to increase their numbers. Mosquitoes, large dam projects and global warming result in larger mosquito populations. Sometimes with when it comes to these supposedly undesirable arthropods or non-humans, or even if you take the virus as a non-human, whether you consider virus as living or not is a different question. The pandemic, where we try to stop the coronavirus at borders, there is a way in which there are undesirable non-humans in terms of border crossings. Like the butterfly and the tiger work really well because they're charismatic, and there are ways in which with the tiger, there's the mythical kinship in many parts of the country here, and with the butterfly, they are charismatic fauna in that sense. Do you think that there are ways in which the kinship and collaboration can exist with this element of undesirability of certain non-humans, supposed undesirability?
That is such a brilliant question. It's a wonderful question. And I mean, certainly countries around the world have closed their borders in the last couple years with precisely that threat in mind. And I think it's in situational terms, it's it's probably important to be able to do that. It reminds me of the debates that we have in this country around invasive species. That's a phrase that you hear. Species that have come from elsewhere, and because they have no natural predator in the local environment, they multiply quite effectively. And invasive vines, invasive fish, invasive insects. I mean, there's all kinds of things that proliferate out of place quite easily. And it's a complicated matter because on the one hand, there's very real evidence of ways in which species that propagate very easily under the conditions of our modern industrial lives do displace local species, do rob other species of their niches and their capacity to thrive. And this is serious. And if one is interested in the conservation of endangered species, for example, controlling those invasives becomes a serious matter. On the other hand, it is also the case that talk in this country of invasive species sometimes does also take on these xenophobic overtones, and people can sometimes move very easily from a worry about invasive species to worry about invasive people. And public health discourse in particular, this is actually an argument that I trace in another chapter of this book project. Public health discourse has, or sorry, I shouldn't put it this way, I should put it the other way. Border politics has long been invested with a certain kind of public health rationality for well over a century. In fact, the idea that you close borders, you regulate borders to defend your own, is something that has its own kind of long and complicated legacy. So I don't know, to be honest, having said all that, how to think around this point in very general terms. I think you're absolutely right that it's complicated and that there are other ways. There's a lot at stake. I think, could one make the case that, I don't know. It's very complicated. I would actually, I would love to see someone do that work, honestly, of trying to kind of think through, as you said, the locust and how we think through, like, what, I don't know. It's I mean, it does in fact remind me of Hugh Raffles' book, Insectopedia, which some of you may know, in which he's thinking in part. He's thinking not just with insects that are objects of attachment, but also insects that are objects of fear and dread and unease. And one of his chapters is in fact on locusts. I think it's important not to overgeneralize here. I'll maybe just agree with that. But thank you for that.
Thank you. So I think we will have the last question from Professor Harilal, because it's quite late in the evening here in India now, and for you also. So Professor Harilal, may I ask you?
Yeah, Professor Anand, thank you for the very interesting presentation. We all enjoyed it. In fact, I also wanted to raise the same question which Aishwarya has raised about exotic invasive species. In fact, no, in Kerala, we have many such examples. They will not resemble the butterfly metaphor, but they will go to the other extreme. where invasive species, like in the Western Ghats and in Kutanad, we have such challenges now. Now, extending the same logic to the world where there are no borders and to the economic life, movement of capital across countries. Not only movement of people, movement of capital, movement of technology, and then also movement of products. When we speak about borderless words and interconnectedness, we are entering into these territories. And extending further, it will be a kind of an apology for globalization, unchecked globalization, about which we have had our experience and we are still discussing. So probably we may have to emphasize the caution you mentioned, that is, while using metaphors and images, one need to be very careful. Yeah, I fully agree with that caution which you mentioned earlier.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this point, Dr. Harilal. And indeed, the piece is written in a certain way, and there are certain points that I make that I don't necessarily dwell on. But one of the things that I did mention is that the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was signed in the 1990s, took on the butterfly as a symbol, appropriated the butterfly as the symbol of transnational,
You mentioned it.
right, cooperation, but then put economic movements into motion that have completely confounded the ability of this thing to survive. Right? It's the aftermath. Like so at the same time that the butterflies celebrated for its movement, the things that happen in the name of the movement endanger the creature. And that's precisely what's happened with free trade, right? And this is and so there's an enormous amount of irony here. And I think like the position that I'm taking here is not an open borders position. It's a position that begins with movement, with relationship, that asks us to begin not with countries or places whose integrity we have to take for granted, but instead with the forms of relationality that bring people in and out of them. And my feeling, honestly, is, and I do believe this, if we were very careful about paying attention to well-being, to the well-being of those who move, to the well-being of those they leave behind, to the well-being of what it is that they seek when they go, if ours was a society that was genuinely careful about those questions, that was genuinely caring about those relationships, it wouldn't look like a kind of open border free for all, because there's nothing careful about that. So the impetus here isn't simply to say, oh, the butterfly, let's open everything up. The question is, like, if we actually pay attention to what beings on the move need, whether in one place or another, that could possibly be the grounds for a very different way of organizing our societies and our economies. But it's a way that sits very uneasily with the way that contemporary global capitalism works. How does that sound as an answer?
Sure.
Harilal, are you satisfied with the answer? That's what I was asking.
Yeah, certainly. My mic was muted in between. That's why I couldn't respond in time.
Yeah. Okay, I think then we have come to an end of this very wonderful lecture, and you have been so patient in answering every single question. We have 2 comments in the chat box, but these are basically comments. One person says that he would continue to watch butterflies in his garden, and the other person has made a kind of a statement about complication of migration by human beings, and so I suppose we have to say a big thank you to you, and we do hope that you are able to visit us fairly soon in person. You're most welcome, and this is a kind of an open invitation, so you don't have to worry about the virus, as to when exactly it is going to allow us. So this is an open invitation. So I thank every one of you for sparing your valuable time, and I think this was a very nice way of remembering Professor K. Raj. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Money. I really appreciate your reaching out, and for all of you for listening and for the conversation. I learned a lot from it, and I definitely have more to think about with regard to this. And yeah, I really appreciate this opportunity to talk to you all. And I would love to visit CDS. It's such a important institution, and I've learned so much from the legacies of the work you've all done. And hopefully we'll have that chance at some point in the near future.
Yeah, I just wanted to tell you that the Museum of Modern Art in New York is having an exhibition on CDS from the 22nd of February until the 14th of March. So if you are going to be in the New York area, maybe you could just go and see that.
On the architecture, is it right? On the architecture?
Yes, it's architecture in South Asia, and we have an exhibit. They have selected our buildings as an exhibit there.
Oh, that's amazing. That's lovely. Yeah. Thank you so much for that. I will definitely try to do that. And I'm also, I just want to say, Dr. Money, that is very kind of you. I know that, it's, of course, Dr. Raj was an economist, and there are a lot of economists at CDS, and it was just very kind of you to reach out. And I realize this may be a little different in kind of style and tone than maybe a lot of what you folks do, but I don't know, I appreciate it.
Yeah, we thank you so much, and for you, enjoy the rest of your day, and for us, it's going to be a good night. Okay.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
And integrity. Yes.